If you've been in the world of Qigong or Tai Chi or even yoga for a while, you've probably heard endless lists of health and healing benefits from these practices. Now, I think a lot of these are true. There's so many good things we can get out of practices like Qigong and Tai Chi, but similar to yoga, I think what we're gonna find and what people have found over time is that sometimes these practices can do more harm than good. And it's not always the case, and it's certainly not what's going to happen to everybody. But it's good to know at least a few of the dangers or things to look out for within these practices to make sure that that doesn't become you. We want to get the benefits while minimizing our risk of injury or other problems coming out of these practices. So within yoga, that might have been herniated discs or hip problems. Within Qigong and Tai Chi, the most common injuries seem to be the knees. Let's cover what you might already be doing, or even your teachers might be teaching you to do sometimes, that you really want to avoid in order to keep your body lasting a long time in these arts so you can keep reaping those rewards. Okay, so probably the big one that I see the most in Qigong, I actually trained Qigong teachers. I trained over 150 new Qigong teachers last year. I've got more coming this year. And the thing that I observe the most when I see new teachers or people who've been doing Qigong for a long time, the big mistake I see them making is the tuck of the tailbone. Now, there is some tucking involved in Qigong, but a lot of teachers I find will sort of overemphasize this, and it can be the detriment to people's knees, especially because the way people hear that instruction will often cause them to do it wrong. So I'll show you what I mean. Now, what I've come to the conclusion, based on studying with a lot of teachers and seeing what works best, I think the best thing I've heard is to simply relax the tailbone down. More of an idea that instead of forcing the tailbone under the body, contracting the abdomen to pull up on the pelvis and really pushing it as we're holding, embrace the tree or whatever posture it is, that we really just want to drop the tailbone, just relax it down, allow the low back muscles to release, which is what allows that back of the pelvis to drop down, and just let it happen naturally. Eventually, there might start to happen to be a little tuck under as gravity gradually takes the tailbone down and the sacrum and the quad release, but we don't need to force this, right? So what most people will do when they hear this instruction, tuck the tailbone, they'll do this, okay? Now, how healthy does this look for your knees, right? You're taking all this sheer force that could be being directed down through the hips and down into the feet and into the floor, and you're taking it and you're pushing it, instead of it going straight down, you're pushing it forward into the knees. And I see countless people do this in Qigong, even people who've been training for years and years, they'll wind up doing this, where the chest is leaning back, the hips are pressed forward, the tailbone's tucked, but to get that tuck, they've pushed the hips forward. And now we're putting a lot of sheer force into the knee. So the way to correct this actually is to think of having actually a slight hinge forward from the hips. So typically when we think of tilting the pelvis back, we're thinking about like opening up the front of the hips, and so we wind up kind of doing this. But you can actually think of closing the front of the hips slightly, actually sending the butt back. See, my knees are a little bent, and so are my hips. I have a little bend at the hip joint, my butt goes back, and then I drop the tailbone. You can still stay dropped on the tailbone. You don't have to have a ducktail position, a forward tilt in the pelvis to be here. You can actually be here and have the tailbone drop under. And from there you can stack everything on top of that. And it's really important to use a mirror in these practices, so don't trust what your body's telling you from feeling. Look in a mirror, videotape yourself, and see, is your chest over your pelvis? It should be even maybe slightly ahead of the pelvis, some schools of thought. But what it should not be is behind your pelvis. If you're kind of here, doing Qigong like this is going to be real stress on your knees as well as other body parts too. Second thing is, the knees are a hinge joint, so we don't want to be twisting our knees. They only move in one direction, forward and backwards, right? Really just backwards. It's a hinge joint. The hip, on the other hand, is a ball and socket, so it can move in all directions. Okay, same with your ankle. Ankle's a ball and socket or something like that, and it can move in all directions. So when we're doing twisting or turning motions, we want to make sure that it's not the knee that's twisting and turning, right? And so to do this, we want to find our quad. Our quad is the inside edge of the hip joint. So our hips are ball and socket. If we come to the inside of that ball and socket, basically our like bikini line, that kind of line that shows up here, that's what we call the quad in Qigong. Kind of an important place energetically and physically in Qigong, but here just focusing on physically. So when we're turning, there's a few places we can turn from. One is that hip joint, that quad. We call this folding the quad, okay? Basically what you can do is if you shift your weight to one side, have your toes pointing forward, can you turn your pelvis without turning the leg? Notice my kneecap stays pointed straight forward here. If I turn my leg, I'm doing this. My kneecap starts to point off to the side. I'm kind of twisting my knee joint. So I want to keep my kneecap pointed forward. You can even think of slightly rotating the thigh in and just turn the pelvis out. And notice that it's just the pelvis turning, just folding the quad. You should, if you put your fingers out, you'll actually feel the quad fold over your fingers. Okay. The other way we can twist is to keep the pelvis and the legs stationary and twist only in the waist. So here you can put your hands on your ribs and feel the ribs turning, but not the pelvis. Pelvis not following you. So we can turn from our spine, we can turn from our hip joint, but we don't want to turn from the legs. People do this all the time. They'll knock on the door of life and twist and collapse their legs. They'll do cloudy hands and be twisting and collapsing in their legs. Legs don't like to twist, knees don't like to twist. Twist from your hips or your waist. The last way that people hurt their knees is putting the knees over the toes a lot. We do a lot of wide stances in Qigong and kind of maybe left-right things and Tai Chi Qigong Kung Fu. Some people have really good knees and they can go way over the toes with the knee. But you might have heard, if you've ever done any work in the gym, trainer's always telling you, try not to put your knees ahead of your toes. Most people, this is going to be very stressful for that knee joint. So unless you've built up some resiliency or have some natural resiliency maybe in the knee, try to keep the knees behind the toes. This will often mean, especially actually if you're trying to do gentler Qigong, this is kind of funny, but usually if we try to make Qigong gentler, we might go from a horse stance width to making it a little smaller, right? And then it's a little easier and gentler. But if the movement is meant to be in a horse stance, because let's say there's a left and right shift, like maybe snake creeps down, if I'm in a horse stance, I can really shift left and right a lot before my knee goes over my toe, right? But if I'm in a more narrow stance, I don't have to shift very much for that knee to start to go out over the toe. So actually in gentler Qigong, you might even need to pay more attention to whether the knees are going out over the toe. Now there are ways to strengthen the knees so that you can be in awkward positions like having the knees over the toes and stay resilient, not hurt yourself, and be strong in those positions. A lot of new ways have been created by a man named Ben Patrick, very famous over the last few years, created a system called knees over toes. Now, one of the exercises he got for knees over toes actually comes from Chinese culture. It's an old Asian way of keeping the knees strong, and he actually improved on it using actually some techniques from Finnish loggers in Finland that seem to have really strong knees. So I'm going to go over that in the next video, the #1 most powerful exercise for strengthening your knees. But you can get started with, I have another video that has several exercises from Qigong, from Ben Patrick's knees over toes system, and from a few other areas that I put together into a nice routine to strengthen the lower body, the hips, the knees, the feet, the core, just to keep you with a strong lower body. I call this routine Roots of Qigong, and you can use it right now on my YouTube channel. Just click somewhere around here. I'll put a link for you, but it'll also be in the description. So you can check that out, and in a few days I'll also come out with this video with this secret Chinese/Finnish exercise to get your knees super strong and resilient. Thanks for watching.